I was standing on a deserted street corner in Portland at midnight, soaked to the bone and shivering, when a man who looked like he'd seen ghosts pulled over and stared at me like I was one of them. I'd been hitchhiking for 3 weeks, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the life I'd left behind in Ohio, but the trucker who'd brought me this far had dumped me at a gas station with directions to the Greyhound station that apparently led nowhere. "Excuse me," I called out as his window rolled down, rain dripping from my hair into my eyes. "Do you know how to get to the bus station?" He didn't answer immediately, just sat there gripping his steering wheel and looking at me with an expression that was equal parts recognition and disbelief, like he was seeing someone he thought was dead. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been shock. "Get in the car," he said quietly. "Please." If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It really helps the channel grow. "I'm not supposed to get in cars with strangers," I said, even as I was already reaching for the door handle. Something about him felt safe despite the intensity of his stare. Maybe it was the way he'd said, "Please," like he was the one asking for a favor. "Smart policy?" He agreed, leaning over to push the passenger door open. "But it's midnight, it's pouring, and the bus station is 12 miles from here. Sometimes you have to make exceptions." I slid into the warmth of his car, immediately grateful for the heated seats and the classic rock playing softly on the radio. He was older than I'd initially thought, maybe early 40s, with dark hair that was going gray at the temples and lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled less than he used to. "Thank you," I said, buckling my seatbelt. "I'm Maya." "James." He pulled away from the curb, his movements careful and deliberate. "Maya, what?" "Just Maya, and you're just James?" "For now, yeah." He glanced at me sideways, and I caught something in his expression that looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Can I ask what you're running from?" The question was so direct it caught me off guard. "What makes you think I'm running from something?" 21 years old? Hitchhiking alone across the country with everything you own in a backpack? Either you're running from something or towards something. And people who are running toward things usually have a plan. I looked out the window at the rain-slicked streets of Portland, at the late-night diners and empty parking lots that all looked the same no matter what city you were in. College. Parents who thought they knew what was best for me. A boyfriend who turned out to be exactly like my father. And what was wrong with your father? He thought women were decoration. Pretty things to be seen and not heard, to make him look good at dinner parties and produce grandchildren on schedule. James was quiet for several blocks. And the boyfriend? Same energy, different generation. Wanted me to drop out of school, marry him, start having babies immediately. When I said no, I trailed off, touching the faded bruise on my wrist that was finally starting to yellow. "He hurt you." It wasn't a question. James's voice had gone cold in a way that made me look at him more carefully. There was something protective in his posture, something that suggested he'd dealt with men like Derek before. Once, which was enough. I shifted in my seat, suddenly self-conscious. "So, yes, I'm running. From all of it. From a life that felt like wearing someone else's clothes that never quite fit." "Where are you running to?" "I don't know yet. Somewhere I can figure out who I actually am when nobody's telling me who I should be." Instead of taking me to the bus station, James pulled into the parking lot of an all-night diner that looked like it had been serving coffee and bad decisions since the 1950s. "What are we doing here?" I asked. "You look like you haven't eaten in a while. And the next bus doesn't leave until 6 a.m. anyway." "How do you know when the buses leave?" "Because I've driven a lot of runaways to that station over the years." I studied his profile in the neon light from the diner sign. "You make a habit of picking up hitchhikers?" "I make a habit of helping people who remind me of someone I used to know." There was weight in those words, stories I couldn't read in the tight line of his shoulders. But before I could ask what he meant, he was already getting out of the car. The diner was nearly empty except for a tired-looking waitress and a trucker reading a paperback novel at the counter. James chose a booth in the back, away from the windows, and ordered coffee for both of us without asking what I wanted. "So," he said once we were settled with steaming mugs and a plate of fries I definitely couldn't afford. "Tell me about school. What were you studying before you decided to hit the road?" "Psychology. I wanted to understand why people do the things they do, why some people break under pressure and others find ways to survive." "And what did you learn? That survival sometimes looks like running away. James smiled for the first time since I'd gotten in his car, and it transformed his entire face. Smart girl. What else did you learn? That most people are carrying around damage they don't know how to fix. That kindness is rarer than it should be. That sometimes the people who seem the most put together are the ones who are falling apart on the inside. Speaking from experience? Aren't we all? He leaned back in the booth, studying me with an intensity that made me squirm. Maya, can I ask you something personal? More personal than admitting I'm homeless and running from an abusive relationship? What's your last name? The question seemed innocuous enough, but something in his tone made me hesitate. Why? Because you remind me of someone I used to teach. My blood went cold. You're a teacher? I left academia 5 years ago. What did you teach? Psychology, at Portland State. I stared at him, pieces of a puzzle I didn't understand starting to fall into place. James, what? Morrison. Professor James Morrison, though I haven't used that title in a long time. The name didn't ring any bells, but then again, I'd never been to Portland State. Why did you leave teaching? James was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup like it might hold answers. Because I had a student who disappeared. Bright, brilliant girl with her whole life ahead of her. One day she was in my advanced abnormal psychology class, and the next she was just gone. What happened to her? Nobody knows. She missed an exam, which was completely unlike her. When I went to check on her, her roommate said she'd packed a bag and left in the middle of the night. No note, no explanation, no contact with family or friends. What would you do if you were in my place? Tell me in the comments. I felt like I was walking into a trap I couldn't see. And you think I remind you of her? I think you could be her twin. The words hung between us like an accusation. I set down my coffee cup with trembling hands, suddenly understanding why he'd stared at me like I was a ghost. What was her name? Sarah Chen. I'm not Sarah Chen. I know, but Maya, the resemblance is uncanny. Same dark hair, same eyes, same way of holding yourself like you're ready to run at the first sign of trouble. Maybe that's just what all damaged girls look like. Maybe. But his expression suggested he wasn't convinced. Why did her disappearance make you leave teaching? I asked, trying to steer the conversation away from the uncomfortable parallels between me and this missing student. Because I failed her. Sarah was struggling with something. I could see it in her work, in the way she participated in class discussions. She was writing papers about trauma responses and survival mechanisms that were too personal, too specific. But instead of reaching out, instead of asking if she was okay, I just graded her work and moved on. That's not your fault. Isn't it? I was her professor. I was supposed to notice when students were in trouble, supposed to be someone they could come to for help. And you think she was in trouble? I think she was running from something, just like you are. And I think maybe if I'd been paying attention, if I'd offered help instead of just good grades, she might not have felt like disappearing was her only option. The guilt in his voice was palpable, years of self-recrimination wrapped around a mystery he'd never been able to solve. I found myself leaning forward, drawn to this man who'd been carrying the weight of someone else's choices for 5 years. James, I said carefully, you can't save people who don't want to be saved. Can't I? Is that what this is? You think picking me up, buying me coffee, giving me a safe place to sit for a few hours is going to somehow make up for not saving Sarah? His silence was answer enough. I'm not her, I said quietly. I'm not your second chance or your redemption arc. I'm just Maya, and I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Are you? The question stung because I wasn't sure of the answer. 3 weeks on the road had taught me that I was tougher than I'd thought, but also that the world was harder and more dangerous than I'd imagined. I'm learning to be. And what happens when you run out of money, when winter comes and sleeping in bus stations stops being romantic and starts being survival? I'll figure it out. Will you? Or will you disappear the way Sarah did, leaving people who care about you wondering what happened? Nobody cares about me, I said, the words coming out more bitter than I'd intended. That's why I'm here. I care about you. The admission hit me like a physical blow. You don't know me. I know enough. I know you're brave enough to leave everything behind rather than accept a life that doesn't fit. I know you're smart enough to understand human psychology, but young enough to still believe you can outrun your problems. I know you've been hurt by people who were supposed to protect you. And what does that make you? Another person who wants to protect me? Maybe. Is that so bad? I looked at him across the table, this man who'd appeared in my life like some kind of guardian angel with baggage, and felt something shift in my chest. He wasn't handsome in a conventional way, but there was something compelling about the careful way he moved, the intensity in his dark eyes, the way he seemed to see me as more than just another runaway kid. "James," I said slowly, "what exactly are you offering here?" "A place to stay. For as long as you need it." "In exchange for what?" "Nothing. No exchange. Just a safe place to figure out what comes next." I stared at him, trying to read the motives behind the offer. "That's insane. You don't know anything about me. I could be dangerous, unstable, a thief." "Are you?" "No, but then what's the problem?" "The problem is that this feels too good to be true. In my experience, when older men offer young women places to stay with no strings attached, there are always strings attached." James's expression darkened. "Maya, I'm not offering you anything inappropriate. I have a guest room you can use for as long as you want. No expectations, no pressure, just a safe place to sleep and time to figure out your next move." "Why?" "Because 5 years ago, I let someone slip through the cracks and I've regretted it every day since. Because you deserve better than sleeping in bus stations and trusting rides from strangers." "Because..." He trailed off, running a hand through his graying hair. "Because something about you makes me want to be the person Sarah needed me to be." "And what if I say no?" "Then I drive you to the bus station, give you some cash for a ticket, and spend the rest of my life wondering if I made the same mistake twice." I looked out the window at the rain that showed no signs of stopping, at the dark streets that led to a bus station where I'd sit until dawn, waiting for a bus to nowhere in particular. Then I looked back at James, at the hope and fear warring in his expression. "This is crazy," I said. "Probably. You could be a serial killer." "I could be, but I'm not." "How do I know that?" "You don't. But Maya, sometimes you have to trust that not everyone in the world is trying to hurt you. And sometimes you have to trust that not every girl who reminds you of a lost student is a chance for redemption." "Fair enough." We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging between us. Finally, I made a decision that would change everything. Okay, I'll stay. But just for a few days until I figure out what comes next." His smile was brilliant, transformative. Just for a few days. James's house was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of the sterile bachelor pad I'd imagined, it was warm and lived in, full of books and plants and the kind of comfortable furniture that suggested someone who'd learned to make a home for himself. "Sarah's room," he said, showing me to a bedroom that was clearly meant for guests but felt oddly personal. "I mean, the guest room." "Sorry. You think about her a lot." "Every day for 5 years." I set my backpack down on the bed, taking in the details of the space-soft lighting, clean sheets that smelled like lavender, a bookshelf full of psychology texts and novels. "This is beautiful." "Thank you." "There are towels in the bathroom, food in the kitchen. Help yourself to whatever you need." "James?" I caught his arm as he turned to leave, and felt electricity shoot through me at the contact. "What happens now?" "Now you get some sleep. Tomorrow we figure out the rest." But as I lay in the dark that night, listening to the rain against the windows and the sound of James moving around the house, I had the feeling that the rest was going to be more complicated than either of us had anticipated. I woke up to the smell of coffee and something that might have been actual homemade breakfast, which was more kindness than I'd experienced in months. When I made my way to the kitchen, I found James at the stove, fully dressed, despite the early hour. "You're up early," I said, accepting the mug of coffee he handed me. "Couldn't sleep? You?" "Best night's sleep I've had in weeks." I settled onto a bar stool at his kitchen island, watching him work. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Are you attracted to me because I look like her?" The question hung in the air like smoke. James stopped stirring whatever was in the pan and looked at me directly. "I'm attracted to you despite the fact that you look like her." "What's the difference?" "The difference is that Sarah was my student, and what I felt for her was inappropriate and something I never acted on. What I feel for you." He trailed off, setting down the spoon. What I feel for you has nothing to do with her. What do you feel for me? That's a dangerous question, Maya. I'm feeling pretty dangerous lately. He moved closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne and see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. I feel like I've been waiting my whole life for someone to walk into it and make everything make sense. And you think that's me? I think you're the first person in 5 years who's made me feel like maybe I deserve a second chance at happiness. Have you ever met someone who changed your perspective on everything? Share your story in the comments. The words hung between us like a confession, dangerous and beautiful and completely inappropriate given that we'd known each other for less than 12 hours. James, I said carefully, this is moving really fast. I know. The age difference alone. I know. People would think. I don't care what people think. He stepped back, giving me space to breathe. But I care what you think. And if this is too much, too fast, too complicated, just say the word and I'll drive you to that bus station. I looked at him, this man who'd rescued me from the rain and offered me sanctuary with no strings attached, who looked at me like I was worth saving even when I wasn't sure I was worth the effort. What if I don't want to go to the bus station? Then you don't go. What if I want to stay here with you and see what happens? Then you stay, even though it's crazy? Especially because it's crazy. 6 months later, I'm writing this from the same kitchen where James made me breakfast that first morning, where he told me he was attracted to me despite my resemblance to his lost student. We never did find out what happened to Sarah Chen, but we did learn that sometimes the people who save you aren't the ones you expect, and sometimes the life you're running toward is standing right in front of you, offering coffee and a chance at something extraordinary. If stories like this give you hope, make sure you're subscribed. I share one real story every single day, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.